The rusty gates of Stone Valley Maximum Security Prison creaked open on a cold autumn morning. A transport van pulled up to the intake area, its tires crunching against the gravel. The guards weren't expecting anyone special that day, just another inmate transferred to process through the system. The van's back doors swung open, and out stepped a man who would change everything about Stone Valley, though nobody knew it yet. He wasn't particularly tall, maybe 5'9", with a lean build that didn't draw attention. His eyes, though, they held something different. If anyone had looked closely, they might have noticed how those eyes took in everything: the guard positions, the camera angles, the worn spots in the fence where previous escape attempts had been made. The intake process was routine. "State your number," barked the processing officer, barely looking up from his paperwork. The new inmate's voice was surprisingly soft when he responded, almost gentle. It was the kind of voice you'd expect from a school teacher, not someone sentenced to 25 years. The prison-issued clothes they gave him were a size too big, orange jumpsuit hanging loose around his shoulders, standard-issue shoes that had seen better days. He didn't complain. Didn't say much of anything, really. Just nodded and followed instructions as they took his fingerprints, photographed him, and led him through the medical screening. In the holding cell, other new arrivals tried to size him up. There was something about his stillness that made them nervous, though they couldn't say why. He sat on the metal bench, hands folded in his lap, watching the shadows from the bed windows move across the floor. One young guy, in for his first stint, tried starting a conversation. "What you in for, old man?" The new inmate just smiled, not threatening, not friendly, just knowing. The guards doing the processing had seen thousands of inmates come through those gates. Tough guys, scared guys, angry guys. They thought they'd seen it all. This one was different. Officer Reynolds, a 20-year veteran, would later say it was like watching a wolf wearing sheep's clothing, but even that wasn't quite right. This was something else entirely. Word spread quickly through the cell blocks about the new arrival. The way he walked down the corridor to his assigned cell was too measured, too aware. Some of the lifers noticed it first, the way he kept his back to the wall, how his eyes regularly scanned his surroundings without being obvious about it. These were the habits of someone who had spent a lifetime watching his back, someone who had survived things that would have broken others. His cell assignment was in Block D, the roughest section of Stone Valley. The kind of place where new inmates usually lasted about a week before begging for protective custody. His cellmate, a heavily tattooed man serving life for armed robbery, tried the usual intimidation routine, crowding the new guy's space, making vague threats about cell block rules. The new inmate listened politely, then went about making his bed with military precision. During dinner in the mess hall that first evening, everyone watched how the other inmates would react to him. In prison, first impressions meant everything. He took his food tray without complaint, even when the server deliberately gave him the smallest portions. Found a seat alone, ate methodically, kept his eyes on his food, but somehow seemed aware of every movement around him. A group of inmates at the next table, the ones who usually welcomed new arrivals with violence, studied him throughout the meal. They saw what looked like an easy target. Quiet, solitary, no obvious gang tattoos or affiliations. They started planning, not knowing they were marking themselves for a lesson they'd never forget. As the sun set on his first day, the new inmate sat on his bunk, a worn paperback book in his hands. The prison library's copy of The Art of War, an interesting choice that nobody paid attention to. The evening count came and went. Guards called for lights out. In the darkness, he remained awake, listening to the symphony of prison sounds, snoring, distant arguments, the shuffle of night guards' footsteps. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. The other inmates had already decided he was prey, and that was exactly what he wanted them to think. After all, he hadn't built one of the largest underground empires in the country by letting people see him coming. In the morning, the real game would begin. But for now, he let them believe he was just another nameless face in orange, just another number in the system. Little did they know, they weren't getting a new inmate, they were getting a chess master who had been playing the long game his entire life. And Stone Valley Prison was about to become his new board. The first week in Stone Valley Prison unfolded exactly as the new inmate expected. Small things started disappearing from his cell, his toothpaste one day, his extra soap the next. His commissary items vanished within hours of purchase. It was textbook prison bullying, the kind of thing that broke most new arrivals. But then again, he wasn't most new arrivals. A group of inmates, led by a mountain of a man everyone called Big T, had claimed ownership of Block D years ago. They watched the new guy's every move, testing the waters. Big T stood nearly 6.5 feet tall, with arms thick as tree trunks and a gang of loyal followers who'd earned their reputation for violence. During yard time, they started their usual routine. A shoulder check here, a foot stuck out to trip there. The new inmate moved like water around these obstacles, never reacting, never showing anger. Just quiet observation and that same knowing smile that was starting to get under Big T's skin. "Ain't you got nothing to say?" One of Big T's followers growled after deliberately spilling water on the new inmate's book in the common area. The new guy simply dried the pages with his sleeve, his movements calm and deliberate. But something in his eyes made the aggressor step back, just for a moment, but long enough for others to notice. Word spread through the prison grapevine about the strange new inmate who wouldn't break. Some thought he was scared stupid. Others wondered if he was simple-minded. The more experienced inmates, though, the ones who'd survived decades behind bars, they saw something different. They noticed how he always sat with his back to a wall, how he memorized the guards' rotation schedules, how he knew exactly which cameras worked and which ones didn't. One morning, the new inmate's cell was trashed during breakfast. His few possessions were scattered, his bed was stripped, and threatening messages were scrawled on his walls. The guards did their perfunctory investigation, finding nothing as usual. But the new inmate didn't report anything missing, because nothing was. Everything of value had been carefully hidden in places only a master of deception would think to look. During afternoon recreation, Big T's crew surrounded him in the weight yard. 6 large men formed a circle, blocking the guard's view. It was a well-practiced routine that had broken countless inmates before. Big T stepped forward, cracking his knuckles, a sound that usually struck fear into the hearts of their targets. "Time to learn your place," Big T announced, his voice carrying across the yard. Other inmates gathered to watch, expecting the usual show of dominance. The new inmate stood quietly, hands relaxed at his sides, weight perfectly balanced. To most observers, he looked helpless. But the old-timers saw something else. They saw a cobra waiting to strike. "I've already found my place," the new inmate replied, his voice carrying a hint of amusement that made Big T's face flush red with anger. "Maybe you should worry about keeping yours." The words hung in the air like smoke. They weren't loud or threatening, but something about how he said them made several of Big T's crew exchange uncertain glances. For the first time, doubt crept into their minds. Who was this man who showed no fear? In the mess hall that evening, rumors started circulating. Someone claimed they had a cousin in Chicago who knew something about the new inmate. Another whispered about headlines from years ago about a shadow figure who controlled the streets without ever being seen. The stories seemed impossible, but they spread like wildfire through the prison population. Big T's crew started noticing strange things. Their usual suppliers became hesitant to deal with them. Longtime allies suddenly couldn't meet their eyes. Even some of the guards seemed to be watching them more closely. The power dynamics were shifting, subtle as sand through an hourglass. That night, lying in his bunk, the new inmate listened to the whispers spreading through the cell block. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. In the outside world, he had built his empire by understanding human nature, fear, greed, respect, loyalty. Prison was no different. It was just a smaller pond with bigger fish. As lights out was called and darkness fell over Stone Valley, Big T lay awake in his cell, troubled by a growing realization. For the first time in years, he felt something he'd almost forgotten, fear, not of violence or power, but of something more terrifying, the unknown. Because somehow, without throwing a single punch, the new inmate had managed to do what no one had done before. He'd made Big T question his own authority. The chess pieces were moving, and tomorrow would bring another day of this delicate dance. The new inmate closed his eyes, content with the knowledge that his reputation was beginning to spread. Soon, they would all understand exactly who they'd been trying to bully. But for now, he waited patiently, letting them dig their own graves with every act of disrespect. The shower room in Block D was always a dangerous place. Steam filled the air that morning, making visibility poor, exactly how Big T's crew wanted it. They'd been planning this moment for days, waiting for the perfect opportunity to put the new inmate in his place once and for all. 6 of them entered casually, spreading out in what looked like random positions, but was actually a carefully planned formation. The new inmate was already there, water running over his shoulders as he faced the wall. He didn't turn around when they entered, didn't even seem to notice them. But his fingers had stopped moving through his hair, frozen in mid-motion. "No cameras in here." Big T's right-hand man sneered, his voice barely audible over the running water. "No guards either. Just us and you." The steam swirled between them like fog on a battlefield. Other inmates who had been showering quietly gathered their things and left. Everyone knew what was coming, or thought they did. The remaining water sounds echoed off the concrete walls, creating an eerie symphony of droplets and tension. "You know," the new inmate spoke softly, still not turning around. "In my experience, it's not the number of fighters that matters. It's their understanding of the situation." His voice carried no fear, no anger, just a calm certainty that made several of Big T's men shift uncomfortably. The first move came from behind, a rushed attack aimed at grabbing the new inmate's arms. What happened next would be talked about in Stone Valley for years to come. The new inmate moved like flowing water, his every motion precise and practiced. The attacker found himself face first against the shower wall, his arm locked behind him at an angle that made him whimper. "That's one," the new inmate said quietly, releasing the man who slumped to the wet floor. The next 2 came together, thinking their numbers would overwhelm him. They were wrong. The new inmate's movements were almost beautiful in their efficiency, no wasted energy, no flashy moves. One attacker went down clutching his knee, the other found himself struggling to breathe after a precise strike to his solar plexus. 3. The new inmate counted, steam still swirling around him like a ghostly audience. Big T's right-hand man pulled out a makeshift weapon, a toothbrush with a razor melted into the end. The new inmate actually smiled then, a small expression that carried decades of street wisdom. The weapon clattered to the floor seconds later, followed by its wielder who was now crabbling a dislocated shoulder. 4. The remaining 2 men, including Big T himself, stood frozen. They'd seen violence before, had dealt plenty of it themselves. But this was different. This was expertise born from years of survival, refined into an art form. The new inmate hadn't even raised his voice or broken a sweat. Now, the new inmate said, finally turning to face them, water running down his chest, "We can either finish this dance, or we can have a conversation about how things are going to work from now on." Big T, for the first time in his prison career, took a step back. Something in those eyes, something that spoke of darker places, of battles fought in shadows, of an underworld most could never imagine, made him realize his terrible mistake. Who are you?" Big T managed to ask, his voice barely a whisper. The new inmate's response was interrupted by the sound of guards approaching, right on schedule, just as he planned. He'd timed everything perfectly, knowing their patrol routes by heart. By the time they arrived, everyone was simply showering, no evidence of what had transpired except for a few men nursing injuries they'd swear came from slipping on the wet floor. That afternoon, whispers spread through the prison like wildfire. Stories about the new inmate's identity started emerging from unlikely sources. A guard who'd worked in Chicago mentioned a legendary figure who'd controlled the city's underworld without ever being seen. An older inmate recalled headlines about a criminal mastermind who had outmaneuvered both rival gangs and federal agents for decades. In the prison yard, people started noticing how others treated the new inmate. Respected old-timers nodded to him with deference. Even the guards seemed to watch him differently, as if finally sensing the predator that had been hiding in plain sight. Big T's crew was notably absent from their usual spots that day. When they did emerge, they were quieter, subdued. The power dynamics of Stone Valley had shifted in the space of a single morning, as smooth and inevitable as the tide. That evening, the new inmate sat in his cell reading a book about ancient military strategies. He'd achieved everything he needed to without a single death, without any serious injuries, without giving the administration any reason to lock down the block. It was the same way he'd built his empire on the outside, through precision, intelligence, and perfectly calculated shows of force. As night fell over Stone Valley, inmates whispered about what they'd witnessed. Some said he moved like a ghost. Others claimed he had eyes in the back of his head. But the truth was simpler and more frightening. He was a man who had spent his life mastering the art of power, and Stone Valley was just another kingdom to rule. The message was clear to everyone now. They hadn't been bullying a helpless new inmate. They'd been playing with fire, and they were lucky to have only been burned a little. Tomorrow would bring a new order to Stone Valley, and at its center would be the man who had walked in looking like prey, but had proven to be the ultimate predator. News travels fast in prison, but truth travels even faster. The morning after the shower room incident, the atmosphere in Stone Valley had changed completely. Inmates who'd been there for decades said they could feel it in the air. Something big was coming. It started with a new arrival in the visitor's room. An old man, well-dressed in an expensive suit, who signed in to visit the new inmate. The guards noticed how the visitor's hands shook slightly when he wrote the name on the form. One of the senior guards recognized him, a retired detective who'd worked organized crime cases in Chicago for 30 years. The meeting was brief, just 15 minutes. But those who watched saw how the retired detective's face went pale when the new inmate smiled at him. They spoke quietly, their words lost to the prison's background noise, but the detective's respect and fear was visible to everyone in the room. After the visit, rumors exploded through the prison like wildfire. A kitchen worker claimed he'd overheard the guards talking about their visitor. The detective had spent his entire career trying to catch someone known only as the Ghost, a figure so mysterious that most people thought he was just an urban legend. A criminal mastermind who'd built an empire without ever leaving a trace. In the yard that afternoon, older inmates started sharing stories they'd heard on the streets. Stories about a man who controlled Chicago's underworld without ever being seen, who could make millions disappear without a trace, who had outsmarted federal agents, rival gangs, and corrupt politicians for decades. I heard he once took down an entire rival organization without firing a single shot, one lifer whispered to another as they watched the new inmate reading quietly in the corner of the yard. Just use their own greed against them. By the time they realized what was happening, they'd already destroyed themselves. The prison librarian noticed how the new inmate's reading choices suddenly seemed more significant. Books on psychology, military strategy, ancient philosophy, the tools of someone who saw life as a complex game of chess. She remembered how he'd asked about books on prison architecture his first week, claiming an interest in civil engineering. Even the guards started connecting the dots. They reviewed old security footage with new eyes, noticing how the new inmate had mapped out every blind spot, every weakness in their patrol routes. He hadn't been passive during his first weeks. He'd been studying them all, learning the prison's rhythms like a musician learning a new piece. Big T's former allies started distancing themselves quickly. Nobody wanted to be associated with the people who had tried to bully the most dangerous strategic mind in the Midwest. Some even attempted to curry favor with the new inmate, bringing him extra food or offers of protection he clearly didn't need. In the prison chapel, an older inmate who'd served time in Chicago approached the new inmate with shaking hands. "I was there," he whispered, "the night of the Harbor District incident, when 3 rival families went to war and only one man walked away with everything. That was you, wasn't it?" The new inmate just smiled that same knowing smile and returned to his prayer book. But word of the exchange spread, and suddenly the Harbor District story was on everyone's lips. How an entire neighborhood's power structure had been dismantled in one night, without a single gunshot traced back to the true victor. During dinner that evening, everyone watched how he moved through the cafeteria. They saw it now, the perfect economy of movement, the way he was always aware of every exit, how others unconsciously moved out of his way. He'd been hiding in plain sight, wearing his power like a well-tailored suit that only now became visible to those around him. A young guard, new to Stone Valley, asked one of the veterans why everyone was suddenly treating this quiet inmate differently. The older guard just shook his head. "Kid, we've had drug lords in here, gang leaders, all kinds of tough guys. But this man, he's the kind that makes those guys wake up in cold sweats." In their cells that night, inmates lay awake, piecing together all the signs they'd missed. How he'd never once raised his voice or thrown the first punch. How problems around him seemed to solve themselves. How those who showed him respect suddenly found their prison lives becoming easier, while those who challenged him faced a string of mysterious bad luck. The next morning, when he walked into the yard, the crowd parted like water. Not out of fear exactly, but something deeper, respect mixed with awe. They'd finally understood what it meant to be in the presence of a legend. A man who hadn't just survived in the criminal underworld, but had mastered it so completely that his name was still whispered years after his apparent retirement. As the sun set on Stone Valley that evening, the new inmate sat in his cell, writing a letter. The same small smile played on his lips, the smile that everyone now understood wasn't just confidence, but the expression of someone who had never once lost control of any situation he entered. Stone Valley wasn't his prison, it was just his newest kingdom. The changes in Stone Valley Prison happened so smoothly that most people couldn't pinpoint exactly when things shifted. It was like watching a master artist at work, every brushstroke so subtle you barely noticed it, but the overall picture was transforming before your eyes. The first changes came in the yard. The usual territorial lines that divided different groups began to blur. Where there had once been strict boundaries keeping everyone apart, now there were small groups of inmates from different backgrounds talking together, sharing cigarettes, even playing chess. It's the strangest thing, one guard mentioned to another during their break. Last week, those two groups wouldn't even look at each other without starting a fight. Now they're sitting at the same table during meals. What the guards didn't see was how the new inmate had orchestrated every interaction, using his influence like a conductor leading an orchestra. The prison economy started changing too. The old system of extortion and forced favors gave way to something more organized, more fair. Somehow, without any obvious intervention, the strongest inmates started protecting the weaker ones instead of targeting them. Even the drug trade, which had been a constant source of violence, became more controlled. Less overdoses, less fighting over territory. In the library, the new inmate held court like a philosopher king. Younger inmates would bring him their problems. Conflicts over debts, personal beefs, family troubles on the outside. They'd leave with solutions that seemed to benefit everyone involved. The librarian noticed how he never raised his voice, never made threats. He just asked questions that made people see situations in new ways. "Watch how he does it," an old-timer explained to his cellmate. "He doesn't tell people what to do. He makes them think it was their idea all along. That's real power, the kind that changes minds, not just breaks bodies." Even the guards found themselves unknowingly playing their part in his system. They noticed fewer incidents to report, less contraband to confiscate. Their jobs became easier, though they couldn't explain why. Some of them even found themselves consulting him informally about ways to keep the peace. One afternoon, a fight broke out in the cafeteria, or it would have, if not for the invisible web of influence the new inmate had woven. Before the first punch could be thrown, 3 respected inmates stepped in, calming things down with just a few quiet words. The potential fighters found themselves being guided away from confrontation, offered face-saving alternatives that left everyone's pride intact. "You see that?" A lifer whispered to his friend. "Month ago, that would have been a riot. Now, it's like watching a dance where everybody already knows the steps." The prison administration couldn't ignore the statistics. Violence was down 60%, racial tensions had eased. Even the sick call numbers had dropped as inmates were under less stress. The warden, a practical man who'd seen every kind of prison politics play out over 20 years, knew something was different. But there was nothing he could point to, no rules being broken, just a profound shift in the prison's atmosphere. Big T, once the feared leader of Block D, found himself adapting to the new reality. Instead of fighting it, he became one of the new system's strongest supporters. Those who knew him best could hardly believe the change. But then again, everyone was changing in small ways. "It's like he saw the best version of me," Big T confided to his cellmate late one night. "Not just what I was, but what I could be. And somehow that made me want to be that better person." The new inmate's cell became a kind of unofficial office. Inmates would stop by during yard time, seeking advice or offering information. Each conversation was brief, quiet, but the ripples spread throughout the prison community. Grievances were addressed before they could explode into violence. Old enemies found ways to coexist. During a Sunday church service, the prison chaplain noticed something remarkable. Inmates who'd once segregated themselves by race and gang affiliation were now sitting mixed together, sharing hymn books and responding to each other's prayers. The new inmate sat in the back, as always, but his influence was visible in every peaceful interaction. "I've been here 15 years, the chaplain told his assistant, and I've never seen anything like this. It's like someone showed them they had a choice about how to live, even in here." As the weeks passed, Stone Valley became a model of what a prison could be. Not a perfect place, it was still a prison after all, but a place where violence wasn't the first answer, where respect was valued more than fear, where men found ways to serve their time with dignity. The new inmate watched it all from his usual spot in the yard, that same knowing smile on his face. He'd built something here, just as he built his empire on the outside. But this time, instead of a criminal enterprise, he created a community, a system where everyone benefited from maintaining the peace. You know what the crazy thing is? One inmate said to another as they watched the new inmate reading his usual philosophy book, "He could probably run this whole place the old way, through fear and violence. But he chose to do it this way instead." Makes you think, doesn't it? Indeed, it made everyone think. About choices, about power, about the kind of person you decide to be, even in the harshest circumstances. The new inmate hadn't just changed the prison's power structure, he changed how every person in Stone Valley saw themselves and their place in the world. The lunchroom at Stone Valley Prison was unusually quiet that day. Everyone could feel it, the tension in the air, like the heaviness before a storm. Big T hadn't been seen in the yard for 3 days, and rumors were spreading about why. Some said he was planning something big, a last desperate attempt to reclaim his former status. The new inmate sat at his usual table, calmly eating his food as if it were any other day. But the old-timers noticed how other inmates had positioned themselves strategically around the cafeteria, not crowding him, but ready. They'd learned enough about him to know that he always thought several moves ahead. "Something's coming," whispered a kitchen worker to his friend. "Big T's been talking to some of his old crew from the maximum security wing. Guys who've got nothing to lose." The whispers spread through the prison like electricity through water, everyone waiting for the spark that would light it up. It happened during the middle of lunch service. The doors burst open, and Big T walked in with 6 inmates nobody had seen before. Transfers from the maximum security wing, each one built like a brick wall and covered in prison tattoos. The regular guards had mysteriously been called away for a meeting, leaving only 2 rookies watching the cafeteria. "You've made this place soft," Big T's voice boomed across the suddenly silent room. "Time to remind everyone what prison is really about." His new crew spread out, creating a loose circle around the new inmate's table. Other inmates quickly moved away, leaving a clear space like an arena. The new inmate continued eating his lunch, taking small, deliberate bites. He didn't even look up when Big T slammed his hands on the table. "You're not in Chicago anymore," Big T growled. "All your street reputation doesn't mean anything in here." Finally, the new inmate looked up, carefully wiping his mouth with a napkin. That's when everyone noticed something strange. He was smiling. Not a nervous smile, not even a challenging one. It was the kind of smile a teacher might give a student who's about to learn an important lesson. "Actually," he said softly, his voice somehow carrying to every corner of the cafeteria, "this is exactly like Chicago. You see, the biggest mistake people made there was thinking they had to win through force." He stood up slowly, straightening his prison uniform as if it were an expensive suit. They never understood that true power is about positioning. That's when Big T's crew started noticing things they should have seen earlier. How the other inmates had quietly reorganized themselves around the room. How several of the most respected old-timers had drifted closer. How even some of Big T's former allies were shaking their heads in disappointment. "You really should have checked who else was transferred in with your new friends," the new inmate continued, still smiling. "Should have asked yourself why those particular men were moved to our block this week." Big T's face changed as 3 of his new crew members stepped back, nodding respectfully to the new inmate. They had been his people all along, planted days ago when his sources warned him about Big T's plan. The power dynamic shifted instantly, like a card trick being revealed. "This is what I tried to teach you," the new inmate said, almost sadly. "Power isn't about who can hit the hardest. It's about who can see the whole board." He gestured around the room. "Every person here has a choice right now. They can stick with the old way, violence, chaos, everybody losing. or they can be part of something better. The remaining members of Big T's crew looked at each other uncertainly. They'd expected a fight, but this was something else entirely. This was a man who had turned the entire prison into his chessboard, and they were just now realizing they'd been pieces in his game all along. The really interesting thing, the new inmate continued, walking slowly around the table, is that I'm giving you the same choice. Right now, you can either be remembered as the man who tried to drag this place back into darkness, or the man who helped lead it into something better. The cafeteria was dead silent. Everyone watched as understanding slowly dawned on Big T's face. He wasn't being threatened, he was being offered a way out. A chance to be something more than just another prison tough guy. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Big T did something that shocked everyone. He laughed. Not a mocking laugh, but a genuine one, like someone who finally got the punchline to a long joke. "You crazy son of a gun," Big T said, shaking his head. "You had this planned before I even thought of it, didn't you?" The new inmate just smiled that knowing smile. The best moves are the ones your opponent thinks they chose themselves. The tension in the room dissolved like sugar in hot water. Big T's remaining crew members relaxed, and other inmates started drifting back to their tables. What could have been a bloodbath had been transformed into something else, a lesson in real power. As normal lunch service resumed, inmates exchanged glances of relief and amazement. They'd just watched a masterclass in control, where the real victory had been decided long before the confrontation even began. The new inmate returned to his lunch, once again just another man in a prison uniform. But everyone now understood what that retired detective had meant when he called him the Ghost. Not because he was hard to find, but because by the time you saw him coming, he'd already won. 6 months had passed since that day in the cafeteria, and Stone Valley Prison had become something nobody could have imagined. The warden stood at his office window, watching the yard below with a mixture of amazement and disbelief. Groups of inmates moved about peacefully, some playing basketball, others tending to the new garden project they'd started. "The numbers don't lie," the chief guard was saying, reviewing the monthly report. Violent incidents down by 80%. Drug problems almost non-existent. Even the medical bay is reporting fewer stress-related health issues. He shook his head in wonder. "I've been working prisons for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like this." Down in the yard, the new inmate sat at his usual spot, a worn philosophy book in his hands. But he wasn't reading today. Instead, he was watching that same knowing smile playing at the corners of his mouth as he observed the changes his presence had brought to Stone Valley. The prison library had become a center of learning. Inmates who'd never finished high school were studying for their GEDs. Others were taking college correspondence courses. Even Big T, the former enforcer, could be found there most afternoons, helping younger inmates with their math problems. "You know what's crazy?" one inmate said to another as they worked in the new workshop program. 6 months ago, we were all just trying to survive in here. Now look at us, we're actually living. The workshop had been the new inmate's idea. A place where prisoners could learn practical skills like carpentry and mechanics. The guards had noticed the change too. Their jobs had become less about controlling violence and more about maintaining order. They found themselves actually talking to inmates, learning their stories, seeing them as people rather than just numbers. "It's like he showed everyone a different way," a veteran guard explained to a new recruit. "Not just the inmates, but us too. Made us all see that a prison doesn't have to be a war zone." In the cafeteria, where tensions had once run high, different groups now sat together, sharing stories and jokes. The old racial and gang divisions hadn't disappeared completely. This was still prison, after all, but they'd faded into something more like friendly rivalry than hatred. The new inmate's influence extended beyond the prison walls. Family visit days had changed dramatically. Instead of tense, awkward meetings, there was a sense of hope. Inmates were making plans for their future, talking about jobs and education instead of old grudges and street life. "My kid asked me what I was reading," one inmate told another during yard time. "First time he's ever seen me with a book." That's when I realized we're not just changing ourselves, we're changing what our families see as possible. The prison chaplain had noticed it too. His services were now packed, not because anyone was forcing attendance, but because inmates were genuinely seeking meaning in their lives. The new inmate attended every service, sitting quietly in the back, but his presence seemed to inspire others to look deeper into themselves. Even the prison food had improved, not because they'd gotten better ingredients or different cooks, but because the kitchen workers had started taking pride in their work. Small changes, adding up to something bigger. "You want to know the real magic?" Big T said one day, speaking to a group of new arrivals. "He never told us what to do. He showed us who we could be. Made us want to be better, not because we were scared, but because we finally saw it was possible." The new inmate's cell had become something of a legend. Unlike the cluttered spaces most prisoners created, his was simple, almost Spartan. A few books, some letters, and a chess set he'd make himself. But inmates swore that anyone who spent time there came out changed, seeing their situation with new eyes. In the prison yard, a group of inmates had started a mentoring program, helping new arrivals adjust to life inside. The old predatory system had been replaced by something more like a community. Not perfect, but better than what had been before. You know what the best part is? One old-timer said to his cellmate late one night, "None of this dies when he leaves. He built it in a way that it keeps working, keeps growing. That's real power, making changes that last even when you're gone." The sun was setting over Stone Valley, painting the prison walls in shades of gold and purple. In his cell, the new inmate was writing in a small notebook, documenting his thoughts like he'd done every day for the past 6 months. A guard passed by, doing his evening rounds. Through the cell door, he could see what the new inmate was writing. "Power isn't about control. It's about showing others their own strength. The greatest victory isn't in making people fear you, but in helping them see who they truly can be." The lights dimmed for evening count, and the familiar sounds of prison life echoed through the corridors. But they were different sounds now, conversations instead of arguments, laughter instead of threats. Stone Valley was still a prison, but it had become something else too, a place where men found their way back to their better selves. And in his cell, the new inmate closed his notebook, that same knowing smile on his face. He'd built many things in his life: empires, organizations, networks of influence. But this might have been his greatest achievement, showing that even in the darkest places, light could grow if you gave it a chance.